previous videos, I showed you how to assign material with the hypershader. I also showed you some of the tools to creating a UV map. In this tutorial, I'm going to get a little more in-depth into other ways of creating a UV map, and we're going to use Photoshop to change the textures of an object. Let's have a look at the UV map that was made. There is a tutorial where we made this dog. It started out as a cube, so if we pull up our UV map, it still has half of the cube faces layout. The UV map would be in this square right here. This is using a very small fraction of the available pixels. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is go under UV and automatically map it. That's better. There are other methods. There are times when you'll want to assign a map and keep the relative size of the polygons intact. I'm going to have a link to a tutorial on how to do that in the description. Also in the description, common pitfalls, so you might want to look down there if you're having trouble. Okay, so I'm going to want to have the eyes. Let me get this out of the way. I'm going to want to have the eyes on their own UV map because they're going to have a different texture from everything else. I'm just going to go around and select the polygons. I have, under my selection tool, I have symmetry turned on. If you, again, double click on your selection toolbar over here, and then go down under symmetry settings. I have this on object X because I want to select on the left and the right side of the origin symmetrically. So I'm holding down Shift to select more than one at a time. There are other methods of selection. There's a paint select tool. Click on this. And I can select these polygons with a paintbrush. B makes the brush larger and smaller, so that's a lot more efficient often. Okay, so that's the group of faces that make up the eyes. I'm going to go into UV, and I'm going to do a planar map of this. I'm going to click on this little box right here because I don't want it to be, actually, by default it would be on the x-axis, which would be running up and down, or would be running along this axis and not be a very efficient way. I want this to be on the z-axis, which is coming out of the eyes. So this will create a UV map. Let me pull up the UV editor. This will create a UV map for those faces that are selected in a plane along the z-axis. So when I click project, it is done. Hit W to move it off to the side and have a look at what's left. Resize this. The eyes don't need a lot of detail because they're really just a pair of dots, but they're right in the middle, so I don't want it to be pixelated. That would be bad. So I'm going to have them relatively large. I'm going to select the rest and automatically map it again. I think I'm just going to move stuff out of the way. Try and come up with a good spot for this. I have overlapping UVs, so what I do is select the bottom faces. And automatically map those. At this point, I realized that I accidentally automatically created a UV map that included the eyes, so I can use the quick set selection that I created earlier to select those and remap them. I just go to select, quick set selection, and select the eyes again. Now I go back and do another planar map on the eyes. And move them out of the way. Okay, I'm gonna I'm gonna leave the UV map like that. That'll work for me. File, save scene as. We'll call this old dog UV mapped. Oh, you guys can't see that. Over here, I'm going to change this to a my ASCII because they're backwards compatible. Okay, now I'm going to select my object, and I'm going to create a hypershade or a texture hypershade for it. Under Windows, Rendering Editor, Hypershade. I'm gonna, under the Maya ones, I'm going to create I'm going to do a Thong. Doesn't really matter what I use because I'm going to change it. Next, I'm going to click it twice and just delete one of these. You can have multiple textures on one object. The reason I don't do that is because there is some places where you load it where it's very hard to tell the software. A lot of times it'll work even if you take it all in there together. But sometimes the software, there's some places that you can put your model where if you have two different textures on it, it's very hard to deal with. Like Sketchfab in particular, if you have two different set textures on one object and you want to change anything about them, it's very hard to get it to cooperate. So in general, I like to keep it as one texture. Okay, so I'm going to rename this dog head. Dog head texture. And I'm not going to worry about editing it. I'm going to make sure I assign it to the object. I forgot to do that. Click on the object. Do not click on the texture. Right click on the texture and assign material to selection. If you left click on it, you'll select the texture and then you don't have anything to assign it to anymore. Okay, so with the dog selected, go back into UV, pull up the UV editor, and under create PSD network, this window will pop up. Okay, this is what it's going to call your UV map, and if you set your project properly, it should automatically go into the source images for the project. But if it doesn't, go look up my tutorial on setting your project. 1024 by 1024 is a little bit small. You want to have these at 1024 by 1024, 2048 by 2048, 4096 by 4096, or multiples. I'm going to use 2048 by 2048. And 2048 is not huge, but it's big enough for, so you won't see any pixeling, especially in the more prominent areas. I'm going to want to add color. That creates a layer in Photoshop for color. I'm going to want to add so I'm just going to add a specular. You could add transparency. You just pick what aspects this material is going to have and add those. I'm trying to think, what else do I need? I mean, you might want a bump, but I'm not going to do a bump. I prefer to do those in Mudbox. So I'm going to go ahead and apply. And it already created it. Trying to keep these short, so I'm going to stop here. In the next video, I'll add some texture to the object in Photoshop.